Thank you, and thank you so much for giving us this special opportunity to come speak with you and share some information. A particular thank you to the Connecticut State Library for asking us to share some information with you about the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame and to celebrate Women's History Month. We like to say at the Hall, though, every month is Women's History Month at the Hall of Fame, and we don't think we should be corralled into just celebrating our achievements in 1 month. For over 2 decades, the Hall has been working to dispel cultural myths and misguided notions about women's ability. Indeed, our 109 inductees' stories stand as living and historic proof of all that women can and have accomplished. We feel like the valuable lessons contained in these powerful stories of struggle and achievement are really crucial to fostering courage and confidence in women and girls, and that they really need this information to take an active role in hoping to, and hopefully to shape their future. A young woman like Daniet, a high school student from New Haven who recently participated in our DIY history program, shared her experiences with us when she said, "Every time I tell people what I want to do, they're like, okay, you can't do that." Well, you can hear the teenage in this, can't you? "Okay, you can't do that because you're a girl." I wanted a way to prove that I could actually do it, but I didn't have any proof. Now these women are my proof and my backup. As Daniet's example illustrates, even though women and girls hear all the time now that they can do and be anything that they want, life too often suggests otherwise, and that's why our mission and our work is so important. You've heard about our mission, and I'll summarize it briefly: to honor and preserve Connecticut women's stories and to educate and inspire the continued achievement of women and girls. So many of our inductees' stories are unknown and really lost in the dust of history, and their voices have in many cases been left out of the traditional curriculum and therefore out of the educational experiences of our young people. But we're working every day to change that for the next generation of leaders in Connecticut, and what we're trying to do is help them fill the gaps. Thank you. And we empower individuals to better understand their past and to see how it connects to the future, because I will tell you that the women's stories that you're about to hear, you can still bring universal truths out of these stories, and they're as relevant today as they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And hopefully this will help our young women be equipped to shape the future. We are currently impacting over 50,000 women and girls each year through our programs and resources. And I'll be spending most of the time with you today sharing some of the 109 inductees' stories that form the foundation of all of our programs. And I'll just tell you briefly about those. Number one, our website, if you've not been there, is a tremendous resource. In fact, it's actually content heavy. But designed to be a great resource for students and teachers in particular. So you can go on and learn about all of our inductees. Our tribute films that we do on each inductee is available for download. All of this obviously free of charge. And many of our programs are downloadable off the website free of charge as well. We also have 2 traveling exhibits that travel around the state. We do Talks on the Road programs, which is honestly what I'm doing, with you today. And our newest program, DIY History, is a series of educational modules designed for teachers and after-school program educators to use to integrate women's history into their curriculum. Again, it's based on past stories, bringing those stories forward, and encouraging young women to go out and use their voice to create their own history. All of our programming actually begins with our induction ceremony, where we first share these women's stories through our tribute films and hearing firsthand from the inductee. This year's event on November 12th at the Convention Center, we're hosting under a theme, Connecticut Women Global Impact. We've realized that so many of the women that we're recognizing today aren't just having an impact in Connecticut and not even nationally, but indeed internationally. And we will be honoring Carolyn Miles, who is the CEO of Save the Children, and Indra Nuri, who is the CEO of PepsiCo. We always have one historic, am I right? I am right in your line of sight, am I not? Sorry, I'm not sure how to get out of that because I'm afraid if I move this, I will mess up the wiring. We also induct posthumously each year, so it's usually 2 living and 1 historic, because we still feel it's so important to reach back into history and bring those stories forward that some people may not know about. Margaret Bork-White is certainly an extraordinary example of that. She was the first female photographer for Life magazine and the first female war photojournalist. Her pictures are truly extraordinary. So we're very excited about our induction lineup this year, and we encourage you to join us on November 12th. So I want to start today by sharing with you our theme song called Bread and Roses, which is, the theme comes from a labor movement in the early 1900s. What I'd like you to do, because it's going to very quickly tell you all of the women that are in the hall, try and keep track of how many of them that you know. It takes a minute to come up.
As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, amid darkened kitchens, of new love's gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sound discloses. For the people hear
somebody shout out how many they knew?
12, 19.
19 the highest?
30.
Good for you. That's an all-time high. I have to ask you, are you a history professor?
No, but I am interested in studying history.
Okay. Even with teachers, even when I've been talking to a group of teachers, we've never had anyone over 25 or 28.
Do I get something?
I'm sorry? Yeah. Well, I'll tell you later about that. Perhaps that proves the reason that I'm here, because what the Hall is all about is trying to recognize women of achievement who may not have received their due, but certainly are trying to create role models or provide role models for the next generation of women leaders. Certainly there are many reasons why women have more or less not been included in history, and I could be here for many, many hours talking to you about that. One of the reasons, or one of the partial reasons, I think, and lots of times we don't stop to think about this, is up until the 1960s, history, for really history as long as we've known it, was written only by men. It was male scribes or academicians. And with the women's movement in the 60s and the 70s, certainly there were a lot of writing that went on and has continued to go on by women historians. And I'm certainly not suggesting that men are not fabulous historians and that they have any way systematically left out women. What I'm suggesting is that our voices and maybe our perspective has been missing from much of our history. Most of the history, traditional history that's taught in schools is really done more from a political and economic standpoint, and we all know that up until a certain point, women's sphere was really more in the home. So all of their work that went on socially, for the most part, was considered less important than politics and economics. I'm going to give you, and it's a little scary to be doing this in a state library, what I would consider History 101, to just simply sort of bring you up to date on why it is that women may have struggled for equality, when today it seems like something that in many cases should be natural. And in many ways it goes back to our settlers who brought with them English common law and the idea of doctrine of coverture, which in essence for married women made married women in essence the property of their husband. So if you had property, owned property, had a job before you got married, once you were married, you were considered one entity. All of your earnings went to your husband. You could not own property individually. You could not file a patent under your own name. So certainly that's the way our law books started out. It really wasn't until the late 19th century when one Hartford woman took it upon herself to fight against such injustices that this changed in Connecticut, and it did indeed change state by state across the country, giving women the right to own property, and we'll get into that in a minute. In 1854 at Seneca Falls, which was the first women's convention, it was really the first time women gathered to collectively tackle the issue of being a second-class citizen. Throughout the 19th century, women were certainly instrumental in social movements from temperance to abolition, but it quickly became clear that their efforts were not bringing them any closer to equality. When the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, giving equal protection to all citizens, remember that those citizens were white and male. It excluded blacks and it excluded white females. Women certainly fought for the 15th Amendment that did give African American men the right to vote, thinking that we would be included in that, and we were not. That passed in 1875. It took us till 1920 for the 19th Amendment to be ratified and for women to win the right to vote and to be part of the political process. Even honestly, while fighting for their right to vote during this time, women also began to push hard for access to many different professions, including the law, medicine, and business. Honestly, there were actually laws on the book that I think the original intent was to protect women. So women couldn't work certain hours, they couldn't work at night, and it was honestly to protect them. And even written into the law was to acknowledge the fact that they are the ones that bore children, which they considered an undue burden, so that they were sort of remedied from possibly having to work. So it's very interesting to read the legal history of our nation and see that even when the intention was to protect, in essence, what it did was, again, put us aside as a separate citizens with separate rights. As you know, women were, and I am totally forgetting that let me get us up to date here. Seneca Falls, the social movements, the 14th and 15th, winning the 19th Amendment, and brings me to all of women's participation in helping with the war and going to work and working in factories, et cetera, to build planes and boats, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the war was over, really systematically asked not only to step down, but to go home, back to the kitchen, and in many cases produce the next generation because we had unfortunately lost so many men. I think the disappointment of having been exposed to working and being in many cases very successful, and then on top of really the beginning of the civil rights movement, when even women like Gloria Steinem professed that she found herself in meetings working side by side with men for civil rights and was asked to get coffee. And, you know, I think the combination of post-World War II and these sorts of issues certainly is an indication of why there was a women's movement in the 60s and 70s. All of these efforts resulted in several changes to the federal laws throughout the 60s and 70s, including the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which was supposed to give women, or that we would be paid equally for equal work. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1974 sought to eliminate discrimination in hiring based on gender, race, and religion. And in 1972, and I'm certainly not implying that this is where the laws stop, it's just that Title IX was such a pivotal moment for women in that it really created the model for federal and state efforts to provide equal educational opportunities for women. So today we're going to explore how Connecticut women were instrumental in these political and social shifts. But I'd like you to keep in mind that you can pass laws, but changing minds is a lot more difficult. So let's start with, and not leave you on all doom and gloom. A great place to start, I think, is with our state heroine, Prudence Crandall. How many of you knew she was our state heroine? Okay. Prudence really found herself as a symbol on struggle for civil rights in, she ran a female boarding school in Connecticut. You know, it's so hard to do this in 30 minutes because not giving these women their due, but trying to race through this. She did take African-American students, one in particular, Sarah Harris. After that, in Hartford, the state legislature passed the black law forbidding the teaching of African-American students in schools without consent of the town. Prudence was arrested under this law and put into jail. The Canterbury merchants where her school was refused to sell to her. They even poisoned the school's well and prevented her from drawing water elsewhere. She was tried and convicted, but appealed and finally won her case in 1834. After that, a mob burned down her school, and she did pick up and move to Illinois and then to Kansas, where she continued her pioneering work. She certainly had no way of knowing what an impact she could have on history, In the case of Brown versus the Board of Education school desegregation case, almost 100 years later, they were still citing issues from her case. Another woman this is a picture of the Prudence Crannell House and the statue of Prudence with Sarah Harris that stands in the state capitol. Another woman who certainly didn't set out to be a figure in the civil rights movement, but certainly ended up, was Marian Anderson, the renowned contralto vocalist and the first African-American to perform with the Metropolitan Opera. Marian was an extraordinarily gifted child, but turned down for music lessons or in music competitions for the most part. Her teacher did enter her in one competition where she won over 300 competitors. She ended up touring in Europe and did 70 concerts. When her manager tried to book her into the Daughters of the American Revolution headquarters in Washington, D.C., she was rejected because of her race. When First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt found out about that, she resigned from the DAR, and this is not DAR bashing because they're partners of ours. It was simply indicative of what was going on racially at the time. But Eleanor made it possible for her to sing on Easter Sunday in 1939 on the Lincoln Memorial. And let's just hear just a piece of
this. Genius draws no color line. And so it is fitting that Marian Anderson should raise her voice in tribute to the noble Lincoln whom mankind will ever honor. Miss Marian Anderson.
75,000 people showed up with us. What Marian could never know is the impact that she would have on the civil rights movement, but also on one figure in the audience, and that was Martin Luther King when he was 10 years old. Let me skip here to when we were talking about women's property rights. Isabel Beecher Hooker first became interested in women's rights when she found out that women could not own property independently of their husbands. She took this as her personal mission and lobbied the state legislature for 7 years to pass the Married Women's Property Bill, a goal she achieved in 1877. She also became heavily involved in the fight for women's suffrage, and in 1869 founded the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. And just so that, and again, the property rights bills were passed by each state at different times. And for the most part, many of the states that passed the part of the Married Women's Property Act did not do so because the original intent was to make sure that women were considered equal. It was because the Civil War, so many men had left the farms and gone off to war, and if the women did not have the right to own property, they could not buy and sell slaves. So again, it's interesting to look at the intent behind some of this legislation and the impact that it had. Unfortunately, Isabella Hooker died in 1907, 13 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment, but another woman who certainly fought very hard for that was Alice Paul, who was really one of the major leaders in the suffragist movement. Most of her tactics she learned from the British suffragists, and they were actually considered somewhat radical in the United States. She broke away from one of the women's movement leaders and formed her own National Women's Party. Beginning in 1917, she led the National Women's Party to multiple protests and pickets outside of the White House and elsewhere in Washington. She was arrested 7 times, jailed 3 times, and violently force-fed when she went on hunger strikes with her partners. If you've not seen the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, produced by PBS, race and watch it, because it will give you a whole new perspective on what women went through to get the right to vote. And of course, when the force feedings were, leaked to the press, and Woodrow Wilson realized that he was facing a pretty serious marketing issue here with women actually being brutally treated, he did put his weight behind the 19th Amendment, and it was ratified in 1920. That's a picture of Alice raising a toast when the 19th Amendment was passed. So clearly we have a long way to go, but at the same time, American women have come so far since suffrage, and many of our inductees were true pioneers in their fields. And I'm quickly going to introduce you to a few of our more famous political and legal firsts. Clare Boothe Luce, the first woman to represent Congress in Congress, later served as the ambassador to Italy, the first female ambassador to a major country. Constance Baker Motley, the first female African-American federal court judge and a major civil rights attorney who successfully argued 9 civil rights cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Please understand she was doing this in the 50s and 60s as an African-American woman, way before the real civil rights movement. So talking about being ahead of your time. Maria Sanchez, the first Hispanic woman elected to the Connecticut General Assembly. Patricia Wall, the first woman appointed to the U.S. District Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, who later served as the court's Chief Justice. As you might know, the appellate court in D.C. is the next most powerful court in the nation to the Supreme Court. Denise Napier, who is a triple first woman elected state treasurer in Connecticut history, first African-American woman elected state treasurer in the nation, and first African-American woman elected to statewide office in Connecticut. And of course, we can't leave out Ella Grasso, who was the first woman governor elected in her own right. I know this is going to run long, but I just want to give you a quote from Ella, because not only is it so Ella, it's so apropos of what we're talking about today. This is part of a speech she gave at the Gridiron Club dinner in D.C. in 1975. She began by saying, "Our problem began 197 years ago in Philadelphia in Independence Hall. Gathered there were our forefathers, no foremothers. And you know what you get with forefathers? A smoke-filled poker room. We know who was there and we know who was left out. Now, 5 wars and some 6 depressions later, it's begun to occur to some wise voters that something has been missing all along. I think it's the female 53% of the population." I was particularly struck by walking in this room and asking who is on the wall and find out it is all of the governors of the state. Please, it starts back here. Please notice all the way around that it is void of women until you get to the very end with Governor Grasso and Governor Rell. Other firsts, certainly in different fields. Adrienne Barnes Wallace, for example, was the first female news anchor in Connecticut. Many of you may remember her, and the first African-American newscaster in New England. You may remember her from Channel 3 in the 70s and 80s. She was called Connecticut's most watched woman. If we move back in time, Mary Goodrich Jensen was not only the first female pilot in Connecticut, but also the first woman with her own byline column in the Hartford Courant. They called her the Girl Pilot. Speaking of the Hartford Courant, does anyone know what its motto is? Older than the nation itself. Let me give you the story behind that. Hannah Bruce Watson, let me just take a sip of water. Hannah Bruce Watson became the publisher of the Connecticut Current in 1977 when her husband passed away and left her with 5 children. And I think it was 5 under the age of 7. The Current was the oldest and largest newspaper in the colonies. 8,000 circulation, was the only one that could keep people informed. When her husband died and she was left with 5 children, the British supporters set fire to the paper mill that provided the Current stock. Instead of folding, Watson recruited a business partner, Sarah Ledyard, and together they appealed to the General Assembly, which organized a quick statewide lottery to fund the rebuilding of the mill, and the Current has not missed a paper a day since that. She was certainly one of the first female newspaper publishers in America, running a very tough business at a time for Connecticut, and things remain tough for women in business for a very long time. Many of the most successful women in today's corporate world credit pioneers of the past who worked tirelessly to pave the way for future generations to enter the business world. One of these pioneers would be Beatrix Fox Auerbach, one of these who took over her father's G. Fox Company in 1927 and made sweeping reforms to the business over her nearly 4 decades at the helm. She really was a pioneer in labor relations. Innovative business practices. She believed in free product delivery, a toll-free telephone order department, fully automated billing, revolutionized labor practices like instituted a 5-day, 40-hour work week, not-for-profit medical and lunch facilities, interest-free loans for employees in the event of a crisis, and the hiring of African-American employees for positions with an opportunity to advance, honestly, in those days, probably past what would have been considered janitorial work. So she was way ahead of her time. Just to give you a few stats, the Fortune 500 list was first published in 1955. It was 1972 when the first female CEO appeared in the Fortune 500 list. But now, more than 40 years later, there are still only 24 companies with female CEOs on the list. That's just 4.8%. One of those that we love to mention is our inductee, Anna Mulcahy, who became CEO of Xerox in 2001. At that time, the list was even more elite, with only 6 female CEOs. She was one of 6 in the country at the time. She is credited with turning Xerox around from near bankruptcy and also turning it over to an African-American woman when she left. So that is the first female Fortune 500 CEO turning the reins over to another female. First time in history. Our sports category is one of the smallest group of inductees, but they are certainly a mighty bunch. From Olympic gold medal figure skater Dorothy Hamill to golf legend Glenna Colette-Vare and Title IX advocate Donna Lopiano. Many of them had no female sports stars to look up to. Indeed, another inductee, Joan Joyce, who idolized Mickey Mantle because she saw no female role models. She's grateful now that girls growing up have female sports figures to look up to. She played for the Connecticut Ray Bestos Breakettes as a pitcher and is credited with striking out Ted Williams and Hank Aaron, 2 of baseball's greatest in history. One of the other fields that we are still lagging with men is in the STEM fields, and I'm sure you all are hearing a lot about that. Women only make up 25% of the STEM workforce in the U.S. That's a stat that has not changed in the last 20 years. So encouraging younger generations to pursue their dreams and give them the opportunities across the board is something that we feel incredibly strongly about. To give you an example, Barbara McClintock really was, in essence, the mother of genetics, but she discovered what was called mobile genetic elements, which really means that genes on a chromosome can jump from one chromosome to another. her theory was so radical that her male colleagues laughed at her and really thought that she was crazy and teased her and somewhat ostracized her. What's interesting is 20 years after her first discovery, people began rediscovering her work, and 40 years after that, she was given the Nobel Prize for her work in physiology or medicine. She remains the only woman to receive an unshared Nobel Prize in this category. So despite the pioneering and groundbreaking work of female scientists like Barbara McClintock, the scientific community has been slow to welcome women. To give you an example, one of our inductees, a distinguished professor of molecular biology, Joan Stites at Yale University, describes approaching a male professor at Harvard when she was doing her thesis work in his lab, and his response was, "But you're a woman, you'll get married, you'll have kids, and what good will all this education do? I'm not going to take the time to be your sponsor." Eventually, she found an advisor willing to work with her and has gone on to be have a brilliant career generating research that has revolutionized the way we understand RNA and has quite honestly been given every grant and award in the country except for a Nobel Prize, which her husband, won 2 years ago. So we're holding out that one day Joan will as well. Our time is certainly growing short, and I haven't even begun to touch on extraordinary women in the arts like Elizabeth Colt and Florence Griswold, who nurtured the arts in Connecticut. Other remarkable artists like Helen Frankenthaler, Evelyn Longman Batchelder, and Annie Leibovitz, who we inducted 2 or 3 years ago. It's quite extraordinary to have Annie standing up on our stage and in tears talking about her connection to Connecticut because she was born here and her father had grown up here. And female firsts like film director Martha Coolidge, the first woman president of the Directors Guild of America. So she is out in California working with Scorsese, Spielberg, and to have a woman head of the Directors Guild was really, well, it definitely was a first. And Theodore Hope Riddle, as you may know, one of the first female architects in the U.S. who designed Westover School and the Hillstead Museum. So I'll take a brief moment to focus on one more inductee, though one who graces our logo, and the last one for me to talk about, and who we all know, Katharine Hepburn. And most of us probably know about Hepburn's 4 Academy Awards for starring roles in films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and On Golden Pond. You may also be aware that she was known as a very unconventional actress with an anti-Hollywood attitude, who wore pants and refused to wear makeup off camera. Many don't know, though, that she came from good stock. Her mother, Catherine Houghton Hepburn, was a staunch advocate for women's suffrage and access to contraception and sex education. She was certainly considered radical and way ahead of her time. So there's certainly still a long way for us to go before women achieve true equality, but one major way we can honor the legacy of all of these women who came before us is by remembering and sharing their stories. We can also make sure to find our way to create social change and perhaps even more importantly, to help the next generation of women leaders to find and use their own voice, again, to go out and create their own history. So ways that you can get involved with the Hall, I encourage you to go on and visit our website and read some of the stories and download a few of the tribute films. They're 7-minute films, and you will hear from the inductees in their own voice, as well as 2 or 3 other people who share important stories about the inductee. They're pretty remarkable. It's sort of it's inspiring at the same time, sometimes leaves you thinking, wow, maybe I need to go out and do something else with my own life. So visit our website, attend our event. You can go onto the website and nominate an inductee. We really encourage that. The criteria for induction is to be born in Connecticut or to have lived here for a substantial time and had a lifetime of achievement while you're living in Connecticut. Let's see, and volunteer. We're always looking for volunteers, anything from people to lick stamps, to help us at the event, to do research for our inductees. So give us a call, we love that. Other ways, let's see, I think this is a repeat. Suggesting our resources to your local schools, connecting with us on Facebook and Twitter. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about remarkable Connecticut women. And if you have any questions, if you have the time, I'm certainly willing to try and answer them. Yes?
When were the nominees selected?
We have a group that's made up of board members and academics. What we generally do, for about the last 8 years, we've been inducting thematically. So we will pick a theme, and then we actually have a base of about 100 women that have been nominated that have still not been inducted. So once you meet the criteria, we always keep you, for example, Margaret Bork-White was nominated in, I think, 1997. So we get together, we have an induction committee, and it's generally made up now of board members, academics from around the state, as well as experts within that theme. We generally try and reach out past our own board and academics. For example, when we were doing Women in Business, it's difficult to get the academic community to identify the best people in business, which is when we used to have a group called the Consulting Scholars, so it was all academics. And we realized that once we've moved past firsts, which is the good news, because it's not to say that there are not more firsts out there, there are, but for the most part, we've captured those that would come immediately to mind. And once we moved past that, we realized we needed people on our board, out in the community, and also the academics. And they are particularly helpful with identifying our historic inductees. And they're so frequently, I remember having Senator Blumenthal say to me in an event, "I've never heard of this woman. This is just crazy, and this is my area. I should have known this." We were inducting, I think, Rosa DeLauro said the same thing when we inducted Isabel Kelly, who drafted and was the first head of the Food Stamp Act and ran the food stamp program. And believe it or not, if you went on the FDA's website, you would hear not a word about Isabel Kelly. Indeed, they'd given the credit to a man, and we wrote them, and they've changed it. So we're trying to bring those stories forward. I hope I answered your question.
Yes.
Anybody else?
Other states have their own holidays.
Great question.
What kind of organization? Is this a state, related to state or federal?
Great question. We are definitely an independent, nonprofit, 501c3. We are one of, I'm thinking now about 17 to 20 other state halls of fame around the country. But we are all, for the most part, we're the only ones that have substantial programs over and above our induction ceremony and that are funded totally independently. Most of them are part of a school, part of a museum, are state funded. We get no state funding. That's not, take that back. We have space on the Southern Connecticut State University campus, which is where we are located now, but we travel all over the state with our programs.
So you get donations?
We run off of corporate sponsorships, primarily for the event, individual donations, and increasingly we are expanding writing grants because we're right in the middle of our new DIY history program, and these individual modules we are really rolling out all across the state, reaching in particular the underserved areas. But once we've set up that infrastructure, we will just continue to write more modules, all based on these inductee stories. And we're doing a STEM module that's going to launch in Hartford in the fall. Yes?
What about Elizabeth Cole? She ran Cole Industries.
She's definitely in the hall, but I can't mention all 109 in a 30-minute. She's a good one. Yeah. I'm sorry, what is it? Anybody else? Thank you all for coming, and thank you for celebrating Women's History Month.